In the year 1914, when the young art of cinema was still finding its breath, a woman's name began to appear in the flickering credits of silent films. Barbara Castleton, graceful and enigmatic, stepped into the fragile light of the silver screen. Her face, pale and luminous, was carried on reels of film that wound their way across small theaters, bringing to strangers a fleeting vision of beauty. Tonight, as we set forth on her story, let us pause together. My dear listener, wherever you are, whether in a quiet bedroom at the edge of night or in a softly lit chair beneath a lamp, tell me in the comments when and where you listen, so we may weave our voices into a global memory. And if these forgotten lives speak to you, I invite you to press the subscribe button, a small gesture that helps this channel continue gathering such stories from the shadows of time. Now, let us begin. Barbara Castleton was born in 1894 in the southern city of Little Rock, Arkansas, though some records waver and point elsewhere, as if history itself could not hold her steady. Imagine the streets of that year, lined with horse-drawn carriages, the air filled with the faint odor of coal smoke and the sweet, resinous scent of pine carried on the river breeze. Electric lights were only beginning to appear in the most prosperous neighborhoods, leaving much of the town bathed in gaslight or the steady flicker of kerosene lamps. It was a world still half in shadow, where each household carried silence with it at night, broken only by the croak of frogs or the echo of a wagon's wheels on dusty ground. Into this stillness, Barbara arrived, another small soul carried by time toward a destiny no one could foresee. Of her childhood, the record is thin, like paper worn soft by many hands. We are left to imagine her as a child running through shaded yards, hearing the whistle of the trains that stitched Arkansas to distant cities. Did she dream, even then, of places beyond the quiet town, of stages and bright lights? Perhaps she looked at the storefronts along Main Street, where illustrated posters of traveling theatrical troupes were sometimes pinned, and wondered at the painted faces of actresses in satin gowns. Perhaps she listened to the gramophone when someone wealthy enough to own one opened their parlor windows and the ghostly voice of a distant singer drifted into the street. We cannot know, and yet the silence surrounding her youth feels like the first sign of the life she would live, brilliant upon the surface for a short time, and then receding, leaving little trace. What we do know is that by the second decade of the 20th century, Barbara had stepped away from obscurity and toward the world of moving pictures. To do so required courage, for the industry was new and uncertain, and respectable society often frowned upon young women who gave themselves to it. Stage actresses had long endured whispers about morality and propriety, and in small towns, such whispers could cling like dust to a reputation. Yet Barbara left behind whatever modest beginnings she knew and moved into the greater current of history. What hunger or hope carried her there? Was it ambition, the desire for wealth and applause, or something gentler, the longing to inhabit many lives, to be transformed with every role? The year of her birth, 1894, had also been the year of a remarkable invention. Thomas Edison's kinetoscope was displayed in New York, allowing individuals to peer into a box and watch moving images. That same year, the Lumiere brothers in France began experiments that would soon lead to the projection of films before gathered audiences. Barbara was born then, in the same year as cinema itself, her life running in parallel to that of the medium she would one day serve. It feels almost poetic, as if she were a twin to the art, destined to share its infancy and to be forgotten when it moved on to a new age. As she grew into womanhood, the world was changing with great speed. The automobile rattled across unpaved roads. Women's suffrage movements filled public squares with chants and banners, and the Great War would soon send its shockwaves across continents. In such a time, the cinema became a refuge, a place where one might escape the harshness of life for an hour and watch, in silence, stories that belonged to another realm. Barbara entered this world like a flame joining a lantern, bright for as long as the oil held, delicate, easily extinguished. The earliest mentions of her career place her with the World Film Corporation, a studio active in the 1910s. These were the years when film reels were hand-cranked, when directors shouted through megaphones, when actresses had to hold their faces in exaggerated expression so that emotion might survive the translation of distance and dim projection. Barbara was praised for her beauty and for her gentle poise. One newspaper described her as a vision of sincerity, though the clipping itself is browned with age and nearly illegible. She was not as famous as Mary Pickford, nor as scandalous as Theda Bara, but she was present, her face known, her name written in programs. For a time, audiences recognized her. It is easy to forget that in those early years, film was not yet considered an art of permanence. It was entertainment, ephemeral. Much like the vaudeville shows, it had partly displaced. Few thought to preserve reels, and many were discarded or burned once they had traveled the circuit of theaters. Barbara's performances, then, were destined from the beginning to vanish. She acted not for the eternal, but for the moment, for the eyes of an audience seated in rows, for the hush of expectation, for the applause that rose and then dissolved into the air. Perhaps this gave her work a poignancy we can only guess at now. I often wonder what her own heart felt as she walked to the studio each morning. Did she marvel at the strange machinery, the painted sets, the bustle of costumers and cameramen? Did she sense that she was part of something larger than herself, that she was giving her youth to a dream? Or was it merely work, a path to independence in an age when women had few choices? The absence of her own words leaves us only questions, and in these questions lies the tender melancholy of her story. The image of her in photographs shows a woman with calm, thoughtful eyes, the kind that seem to gaze not only outward but also inward. There is restraint in her expression, as if she knew that mystery itself could be her gift. Perhaps that is why her memory lingers faintly, like perfume in an empty room. And so her story begins, not with great noise or triumph, but with a shadow and a flicker, a name barely recorded, a childhood barely remembered, and the first tentative steps onto the fragile stage of early cinema. Her life, like the films she appeared in, would shine for a moment and then fall into silence. Yet even silence has weight, and in the hush we may still hear the faint echo of her presence. As the lantern of her life is lit, we see the earliest motion pictures stirred to life, faint images dancing on a wall. The reels begin to turn, the screen quivers, and an audience waits. The flicker upon the wall trembles, uncertain, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. Then it steadies and forms emerge, shadows given shape by light, gestures stretched into stories. In those earliest days of cinema, audiences leaned forward with wonder, some gasping softly as the illusion unfolded before them. A train rushing toward the screen might startle them. A figure leaping from the darkness might bring murmurs of disbelief, yet all remained spellbound. Into this new world, Barbara Castleton placed herself, one among many hopefuls who sensed that this strange new art could lift them into visibility. The reels that carried her face would be spliced together by hand, their edges fragile, their life brief. But for a few moments they commanded silence. They made strangers hold their breath. Barbara found herself within the circle of the World Film Corporation, a company that operated not in the grandeur of later Hollywood, but in the modest rooms and stages of Fort Lee, New Jersey. Before California had yet claimed the mantle of Dream Factory, the East was filled with workshops of cinema, studios lit by skylights, neighborhoods echoing with the crank of cameras and the shuffle of costumed actors. Barbara entered these rooms as a young woman in her 20s, graceful, composed, her beauty suited to the lens. One can imagine her standing among painted backdrops, her dress pinned precisely, her eyes following the director's gesture. She did not speak, for no microphone hovered near, but her silence itself was her language. The art of silent performance required a balance, one difficult to master. Too much exaggeration and one appeared grotesque, too little, and the audience read nothing at all. Barbara was praised for her restraint, for her ability to suggest an inner life without flailing or distorting her features. This subtlety made her seem closer to the audience, less like a stage actress declaiming to the gallery and more like a woman glimpsed in a mirror. Critics noted her sincerity, though the words have aged poorly, the ink faded, the newsprint brittle. Yet we may trust that such praise carried weight in her time, enough to lift her into further roles. She played heroines in dramas and romances, women caught in dilemmas of love and duty, or placed within the moral lessons so common in early photoplays. We cannot see these films now, for most are lost. The nitrate reels burned or dissolved into dust, but we can imagine the typical plots: a young woman torn between loyalty to family and the passion of a forbidden suitor, a figure of virtue threatened by temptation but restored by repentance. Through these roles, Barbara became both a moral figure and a vessel for longing, her expressions teaching audiences what virtue or desire looked like. Each frame captured her features. Each gesture became a code for emotions larger than life. In the darkness of the theater, men and women sat together in rows, their eyes reflecting the glow of the screen. They watched Barbara's face appear, pale against the dark, her eyes glancing aside in sorrow, her lips parting in surprise, her hands lifted in supplication. In silence, she spoke to them. Did they feel that they knew her? Did they leave the theater carrying her image within them, as if she had confessed something personal? Perhaps a young girl walked home thinking she too might enter that luminous world, or a young man lingered with her face imprinted upon his memory. For an actress of the silent era, this was the measure of success, not the permanence of art, but the temporary capture of hearts. As the reels turned, Barbara's reputation grew. Magazines printed her likeness, photographs circulated with captions promising charm and talent. She was not yet a star on the level of Mary Pickford, whose curls became a national symbol, but she was visible, admired, spoken of. She was part of the great experiment of cinema, an art still learning its grammar. Each performance was a step toward refinement, each close-up a discovery. The camera loved stillness, and Barbara provided it, allowing the smallest movement of her eyes to suggest an ocean of feeling. The life of an actress in those days was neither secure nor luxurious. Studios demanded long hours, and contracts offered little protection. Salaries varied, but even well-known actresses sometimes faced uncertainty. Barbara must have known that her fame was fragile, that another face could appear and take her place with the turn of a season. Yet she continued, embracing the flickering reels as her stage. What courage this must have required, to give oneself to a medium so young, to place one's image in the care of reels that might disintegrate within years. Perhaps she believed, as many did, that the films were not meant to last, that their beauty lay in their momentary life, or perhaps she trusted that some record would remain, enough to secure her memory. In photographs, we see her in elegant gowns, her hair arranged in the style of the time, her eyes direct, steady. She seemed composed, perhaps more mature than her years, carrying a serenity that set her apart from the more flamboyant performers of her era. This composure was her gift, and also her fate. For when the world of cinema shifted toward greater extravagance, toward sound and spectacle, subtlety sometimes faded into obscurity. But in these early years, Barbara Castleton was luminous, her light caught in the trembling reels, her silence filled with meaning. I imagine the sound of the projector in those days, its steady whir like the breath of a sleeping child. The audience sits in darkness, waiting, and then the reels spin, carrying Barbara's face into their eyes. There is a hush, a reverent silence broken only by the faint music of a pianist in the corner. And within that silence, Barbara speaks more eloquently than words could allow. Her gestures, her gaze, her stillness, all become a language of the unsaid. It was in such moments that she belonged fully to the audience, and they to her. And yet, as each reel ended, the light faltered, the faces on the screen dissolved into white, and the spell broke. The audience stirred, whispered, applauded, then rose to leave. Barbara's face vanished. Her voice had never existed. Her presence was already a memory. Such was the life of a silent star, a brief communion followed by emptiness, repeated again and again. She lived within the flicker of reels, always present, yet always vanishing. The reels spin on, the faces fade, and in the hush of the theater we wait for what will follow. What new image will appear? What new life will be lived in silence? The audience leans forward, eyes wide, hearts prepared. The hush deepens, for the screen is about to glow again. The screen grows dark, Barbara's face dissolving into nothingness, and for a moment there is only stillness. Then, from the seats, a wave of sound rises, soft at first and then stronger. The applause of strangers who have just witnessed a story without words. Their clapping echoes in the vaulted ceiling of the hall, mingling with the shuffling of feet, the faint creak of wooden chairs, the rustle of coats being gathered. It is in this applause that Barbara Castleton's presence becomes tangible, more real than the fragile shadows on the screen. For in their hands she exists, if only for a fleeting night. Such was the paradox of her life. She was known everywhere, and yet she was never truly heard. A generation saw her lips move, saw the shape of her laughter, the tremor of her sorrow, but none ever heard the timbre of her voice. She was a figure entirely of sight, a woman whose identity was defined by gesture and expression, to be remembered by the world without a single sound attached. What a strange fate that must have been. Barbara's career moved forward through the 1910s, those years when silent cinema was both experiment and spectacle. Each role she played brought her deeper into the strange intimacy of the silent screen, where faces hovered larger than life, eyes magnified to convey thoughts that no one spoke aloud. She acted in dramas that turned upon heartbreak and reconciliation, stories where a glance could condemn or redeem. For audiences accustomed to stage performances that relied upon booming voices, the effect of such delicate expression must have felt uncanny. Barbara was not declaiming to the gallery. She was confiding to each viewer, as if her eyes met theirs directly. The newspapers of the time describe her as a rising star, often paired with other actors of the World Film Corporation's stable. Her roles placed her opposite figures of virtue and villainy. Her character frequently caught in a moral struggle, a mirror of the anxieties of the age. The nation was stepping into modernity, women seeking the vote, young people leaving farms for cities, families torn by change, and silent films became a way of framing these transformations in simplified allegories. Barbara embodied innocence, tested, fidelity questioned, endurance rewarded. The audience saw in her both the woman they feared to lose and the woman they longed to become. There is a stillness in her photographs that suggests how she carried herself on film. Her features are composed, her posture calm, her beauty understated. She does not strain toward the viewer, but draws the viewer toward her. This quality set her apart in an age when exaggeration often seemed the rule. Her serenity became her language. In the silent dark of the cinema hall, her face glowed like a lamp, steady and sure. And yet, behind this composure, what did she feel? When the reel stopped turning and the applause faded, she returned to her dressing room, removed the paint from her face, and stepped into the night air. Perhaps she walked the streets alone, hearing the faint echo of footsteps behind her, wondering if any passerby recognized her from the images they had seen. Recognition in those years was an uncertain thing. Fame was wide, yet shallow. A face known in every town might be forgotten within months, replaced by another projected upon the screen. Barbara lived within this fragile cycle of admiration and oblivion. The paradox of silent film lies also in its intimacy. Audiences sat in the dark, gazing at enormous faces, larger than life, closer than any stage actor could ever be. They saw the tremor of eyelids, the faint quiver of lips. They knew Barbara in ways her own acquaintances might not have known her, yet they did not know her at all. They knew only the shadow, the mask, the sequence of gestures designed to convey a role. She gave them illusion, and they embraced it as reality. Did she ever long for them to hear her real voice, to know her not as a figure of light, but as a woman of flesh? Barbara's rise was steady but not meteoric. She was admired but did not dominate the headlines. Her name appeared in film magazines, her image in promotional cards, but she remained just beyond the realm of the great icons. Perhaps this was a mercy, sparing her from the most intrusive aspects of fame. Or perhaps it was the beginning of her obscurity, a sign that her light, though steady, would never burn blindingly bright. Fame is often crueler in moderation than in absence. It gives enough to awaken hunger, but not enough to satisfy. The silent dark of the theater carried her to many places she would never see. Her reels traveled from town to town, crossing states, appearing in theaters where coal stoves burned in winter and windows were thrown open in summer. Somewhere in the Midwest, a farmhand may have watched her face and sighed. Somewhere in the South, a schoolteacher may have lingered afterward, recalling the sorrow in her eyes. In small mining towns, in bustling cities, her image passed before countless strangers, but Barbara herself remained absent. They saw her face but not her life. This is perhaps the essence of being a silent star, to exist in fragments, multiplied across reels, separated from oneself. Barbara lived in two worlds, the private, unrecorded world of her own days, and the public, projected world where her likeness danced in silence. One was fragile, the other was fleeting, and neither offered her permanence. As her career deepened, she appeared in more films, each one building her reputation. But silent cinema was already racing forward, producing new stars, new spectacles, new techniques. To remain visible required not only talent but luck, and the blessing of studios that often discarded one actress for the next. Barbara walked a narrow path, her composure and sincerity her only shield against the tides of change, and so we see her in the faces of the silent dark, luminous yet vanishing, adored yet forgotten, known yet unknown. She was everywhere and nowhere, a paradox embodied. When the applause rose at the end of each film, she lived. When it faded, she dissolved again into silence. The applause fades now, echoing away into nothingness. The audience shuffles, the hall empties, and once more the screen is dark. Yet even in the dark, a murmur remains. The sound of voices whispering, the gossip of magazines, the rustle of newspapers carrying her name into the world. The rustle of newspapers lingers in the air, thin sheets of print carried from street corners into parlors and cafes, folded under arms and spread across breakfast tables. In these pages, Barbara Castleton's face begins to appear more often, not only upon the film screen but now upon the printed word, where her name is paired with flattering phrases and carefully arranged photographs. The world of publicity was gathering momentum in these years as the silent film industry discovered that to make audiences return, one must not only show them a story but also give them the illusion of knowing the players. The star system was being born, a system where a young woman might be lifted into sudden prominence, her likeness repeated endlessly, her image turned into a commodity. Barbara was drawn into this current, her serenity translated into glossy portraits, her eyes gazing out from the pages of magazines. In these photographs, she appears immaculate, her clothing elegant, her features calm. The stillness that defined her acting becomes the stillness of a portrait, a quality that lent itself to admiration. Readers of fan magazines clipped her pictures, pasted them into scrapbooks, or pinned them upon walls. For those who could not meet her, who had only seen her silent gestures upon a glowing screen, these images offered a trace of permanence. Yet they were no less an illusion, for they captured only a surface, a mask carefully crafted by studio photographers. One must wonder whether Barbara, in quiet moments, recognized herself in those images, or whether she saw only a stranger, someone she resembled but did not truly know. The language used in these publications is telling. Words like grace, charm, sincerity, and talent repeat endlessly, as if to recite a litany of virtues rather than to describe a person. Barbara was transformed into an emblem, her qualities rehearsed like lines in a play. She became a symbol of femininity and refinement, offered to the public as an ideal. In this way, she was celebrated, yet also imprisoned, her complexity flattened into a list of agreeable traits. She was both everywhere and nowhere at once, present in print, yet absent in truth. The nature of celebrity in the silent era was still uncertain. Audiences admired their stars, but the boundary between actor and role was often blurred. Many assumed that Barbara was indeed the virtuous heroines she portrayed, women of quiet dignity, enduring trials with patience. This confusion served the studios well, for it allowed films to carry a stronger impression of authenticity. But for the actress herself, such confusion could be heavy. To live beneath the weight of projection, to be seen as someone else and mistaken for that reflection, what toll did it exact? Did Barbara find herself walking more carefully in public, aware that her actions might betray the image so carefully built? Or did she resent the false simplicity, longing to be recognized as a woman with contradictions and private thoughts? The applause of the theater gave way to the chatter of newsstands, where voices debated her beauty, her roles, her worthiness. In small towns, gossip passed from lips to lips, shaping reputations with little care for truth. Barbara's name became one of those whispered in admiration or doubt, a name carried beyond her reach, never entirely under her control. Fame in those days spread not only through praise, but also through rumor, and the line between the two was thin. The culture of early Hollywood was quick to embrace gossip, for it gave the public a sense of intimacy with those they would never meet. For Barbara, this meant that her life outside the studio was not entirely her own. Every movement, every association, every whisper could be magnified into a story. Yet even as her name circulated, much of her true self remained veiled. Her voice was unheard, her thoughts unread. She was simultaneously exposed and hidden, displayed and concealed. Perhaps this paradox was the essence of her appeal, the sense that behind her composure lay a mystery unsolved. As her image spread, she stepped into roles that demanded ever more subtlety. Silent film was becoming more sophisticated in the late 1910s, its storytelling more complex, its emotions more layered. Barbara's restraint, once unusual, now found a place in dramas that sought greater realism. Audiences applauded her sincerity, critics praised her naturalism. Yet even in these compliments lay an irony. To be called natural is to be recognized as artless, as if her effort were invisible. She succeeded by disappearing, by making her labor unseen. The praise itself concealed the depth of her work. The years passed, and her reputation grew, though always just beneath the brightest constellation of silent stars. She was respected, admired, but not idolized with the fervor granted to the very few who became icons. This place on the margin may have offered her a certain peace, but it also foreshadowed how quickly she would be forgotten. For in the realm of celebrity, to shine less brightly is often to vanish entirely once the light shifts. Barbara lived within that narrow twilight, a presence strong enough to be known, yet too fragile to endure. I imagine the sound of newspapers being folded, the crisp crackle as pages are turned, the scent of ink still fresh. Somewhere a reader lingers upon her portrait, tracing her features with a fingertip, whispering her name aloud. But even as this moment unfolds, the paper itself is destined to yellow, to crumble, to be discarded. The memory it carries fades with it. This was Barbara's fate, to be praised in words that would not last, to be celebrated in images that would disintegrate, to be known for a time and then lost. And yet, even in this ephemerality, there is beauty. To live briefly in the eyes of strangers, to inspire admiration in hearts that never met her, is to leave a subtle mark upon the human story. Barbara's life reminds us that fame is not only in monuments and grand legacies, but also in small moments of recognition, in fleeting sparks of connection. Perhaps this is enough, that for a time she was present in the world's imagination, even if that presence dissolved into obscurity. The newspapers fall silent now, their pages folded away, their rustle fading into the hush of an empty room. But from the silence emerges another sound, the faint whisper of voices carried on the wind, voices that grow sharper, more insistent, rumors, scandals, stories not written by her but about her, spreading through the air. And so, as we leave behind the applause and the printed praise, we step into the shadowed realm where admiration turns to suspicion and where whispers shape the fate of those who once seemed untouchable. The whisper of voices carried on the wind grows sharper now, curling through the quiet streets, slipping beneath doors, gathering in parlors and on street corners. What begins as admiration soon turns into speculation. For no actress of the silent era could move through fame without encountering the shadows of rumor. Barbara Castleton, once praised for her serenity and sincerity, found herself drawn into these currents. The applause that had once lifted her name was joined by murmurs, stories of her private life told in half-truths, spread with eagerness by those who fed upon gossip as if it were sustenance. In these whispers we hear the other side of fame, the side that corrodes and unsettles, reducing the individual to fragments of scandal and suspicion. Barbara's first marriage became a subject of particular fascination. She had wed in her youth, at a time when her career was still beginning, and for a moment the union seemed to anchor her, to grant stability in the restless world of performance. Yet it did not endure. The marriage dissolved, leaving behind only questions. The reasons were not spoken of openly, but gossip filled the void. Some whispered of incompatibility, others of discontent, still others of betrayals that may never have occurred. What mattered was not the truth, but the story. For in the culture of early Hollywood, the story was everything. An actress was expected to be both admired and doubted, adored and judged, her private life a stage upon which strangers perform their own imaginations. In the newspapers of the time, the reports are elusive. A few short lines hint at court proceedings, at a separation noted by society pages, but never lingered upon. Yet for those who watched her on screen, the knowledge that she had been married and then separated colored their perception of her. Some may have felt sympathy, others suspicion. To be a woman divorced in the early decades of the 20th century was not without stigma, and to be a public woman undergoing such change was to invite scrutiny. Barbara bore this silently, her own voice absent from the record, leaving us to wonder how she endured the questions whispered just beyond her hearing. Not long after, she married again, this time to Willard Mack, a playwright and actor whose name carried its own weight in theatrical circles. He was known for his work on stage, for his talent and his ambition, and together they formed a union that might have seemed promising. Yet even here, the whispers continued. The marriage was marked by tension, by the strains of two creative lives pulling against one another. Rumors of quarrels, of estrangements, of reconciliations spread across gossip columns. Once again, the line between truth and invention blurred. For the public, it did not matter whether the tales were accurate. It mattered only that they could imagine her life unfolding as dramatically as her films. One cannot help but ask, how did Barbara feel as she read such words, if indeed she read them at all? Did she hold the newspapers in her hands, scanning the pages for her own name, her heart quickening at the sight of it? Did she feel anger at the distortions, or did she accept them as inevitable, the cost of living in the flickering light of fame? Perhaps she felt only weariness, a resignation that no matter what she did, her life would not belong to her alone. The culture of the time delighted in scandals, for they brought the stars closer to ordinary people. Audiences who admired Barbara's composure on screen found a different thrill in hearing of her troubles off it. Her struggles made her more human, more accessible, yet also more vulnerable. It is here that the cruelty of fame becomes clear. The very qualities that made her beloved were turned against her. The very intimacy she offered through her silent expressions was repaid with intrusion into her private life. Yet within this shadow there is also a strange kind of poignancy, for it reveals that Barbara was not merely an image upon the screen, not merely a figure of light, but a woman with her own longings, her own failings, her own search for companionship. Her marriages, though they brought gossip, also remind us that she sought connection in a world that often valued her only for appearances. Perhaps these unions, however troubled, offered her moments of true intimacy, moments when she could speak in her own voice, be heard not as an actress, but as herself. That these moments did not endure does not lessen their importance. The scandal of her marriages colored her reputation, yet it did not end her career. She continued to appear in films, continued to be praised for her performances, but the whisper of gossip always followed, like a faint shadow at the edge of light. Audiences could not entirely separate the woman from the roles she played. When they saw her on screen, they carried into the theater the knowledge of her divorces, her remarriages, her rumored quarrels. Did this deepen their engagement with her characters, or did it distract them, pulling them away from the illusion? We cannot say, but it is certain that Barbara's life became inseparable from the narratives woven around her. The silence of her films was mirrored by her silence in the face of scandal. Unlike some who defended themselves in interviews, she remained largely absent from the conversation. She let others speak for her or against her while she continued her work. This silence may have been dignity, or perhaps it was weariness. Either way, it adds to the mystery that surrounds her life, leaving us only fragments and questions where answers should be. The echo of courtroom footsteps fades, yet the image remains. A woman walking across marble floors, her heels striking sharply, her head held high despite the weight of whispers. Barbara Castleton, once a vision of serenity upon the screen, now moves through a world where every step is judged, every gesture noted. She disappears through a doorway and the sound of her heels lingers in the air. The echo of heels upon marble lingers, sharp and hollow, fading only as a door closes behind her. What follows is the stillness of an uncertain home, a space filled with fragile beauty, like a house made of glass. It is here that Barbara Castleton's second marriage took shape, a union with Willard Mack, playwright, actor, restless spirit of the stage. Theirs was a meeting of two performers, both drawn to the illusions of art, both carrying ambitions and desires that did not easily settle into harmony. A house of glass can be luminous, catching the sun in dazzling patterns, but it is also perilous. For every vibration, every small shock threatens to break it. Willard Mack was a figure well known in theatrical circles, respected for his scripts, admired for his presence, yet never free of the rumors that accompany men who chase both the stage and its adoration. To Barbara, he may have seemed a companion who could understand the weight of performance, someone who shared her knowledge of what it meant to live behind a mask. Together, they stood as a couple at the intersection of stage and screen, his pen writing lines for others to speak, her silence conveying emotions for others to read. Yet such likeness often breeds tension, and so it did with them. Accounts of their marriage are scattered and contradictory, as if reflected in shards of glass. Some describe devotion, a shared passion for art and for one another. Others recall quarrels, separations, reconciliations, and the restlessness of two lives not easily bound. The press delighted in reporting both, playing one against the other, weaving their names into stories of love's triumph or failure. For Barbara, the scrutiny must have been relentless. To endure one troubled marriage was already a burden in her era. To face a second was to risk being branded unlucky or unworthy. Yet still she walked forward. Still she remained composed, her serenity unbroken in the portraits and publicity that surrounded her. We may wonder what their home was like. Rooms filled with scripts and clippings, photographs on the walls, perhaps the faint smell of tobacco and ink. Did Barbara sit at a vanity, brushing her hair in silence, while Willard paced with papers in his hands? Did their evenings end in laughter or in strained silence? The truth is hidden, lost behind the veil of time, yet the fragility of their marriage was known even then. To be married within a house of glass is to live in constant awareness that any stone, however small, might shatter the walls. Barbara's career continued in these years, and so did Willard's. Their union was a public one, yet also a solitary one. For each pursued their own calling, each demanded the center of attention in different spheres. When the world praised her performances, did he feel overshadowed? When his plays drew acclaim, did she feel distant from that applause? Two creative lives rarely move in perfect rhythm, and theirs seem to slip in and out of harmony like waves that sometimes meet, sometimes crash. And yet, amid the fragility, there may have been tenderness too. We must allow for the possibility that they shared moments of warmth, of quiet companionship, of recognition. Love does not exist only in the absence of conflict. Often it persists in spite of it. Perhaps Barbara found in Willard a companion who, even in argument, understood the demands of art, the strange exile of the performer. Perhaps he found in her a calmness that steadied him, a presence that anchored his restless ambition. These moments, though invisible to history, must have existed, for no marriage endures without some thread of care. The public, however, preferred the fractures. Newspapers hinted at quarrels, at possible separations. Every whisper was magnified until it seemed to echo across the industry. Barbara's house of glass did not shatter in a single moment, but trembled again and again, each crack widening with time. To live beneath constant scrutiny, to feel one's private arguments reflected in headlines, must have been exhausting. And still she carried herself with composure, her serenity unbroken before the camera. The metaphor of glass extends beyond her marriage, for her career too was fragile in these years, glittering with promise but always vulnerable to breakage. Silent film was moving toward greater spectacle, greater innovation, and new faces were arriving with each season. Barbara's steady presence risked being overlooked in the rush for novelty. She was luminous but not flamboyant, admired but not adored to frenzy. In a system that thrived on both admiration and sensation, this left her vulnerable, as if her career too were a delicate pain, waiting for the tremor that might crack it. In reflecting upon her marriage to Willard Mack, one cannot escape the sense of impermanence. They were both artists, both fragile and ambitious, both searching for something in the other that perhaps could not be given. Their union, like glass, could reflect light beautifully, but it could not bear the weight of constant strain. It fractured, leaving behind pieces that catch the light, even as they remind us of what was lost. The image remains. A house of glass, sun shining through, colors scattering on the walls, and within it two figures moving carefully, each aware of the risk of breaking what they inhabit. The sound of shattering is never far away, the shards glimmering with both beauty and threat. And in the end, when the cracks grew too deep, the house gave way. Their marriage did not endure, leaving Barbara once again alone, her serenity tested, her silence deepened. But glass, when it breaks, does not vanish. Its fragments linger, catching light in unexpected ways. So too did Barbara's life, carrying forward traces of what she had endured, shaping the woman she became. From the wreckage of her union, she stepped into the broader world once again, into an industry and a culture that were themselves shifting, changing, preparing for a revolution that would alter everything she knew. The shards of glass lie scattered on the floor, catching the sun in sharp brilliance. One turns to look at them, dazzled, uncertain, and in that brightness another sound intrudes. The low murmur of voices, not whispers now, but a steady hum, the sound of a world changing, of technology advancing, of a new current approaching. Barbara looks toward it, the fragments of her house glinting around her, and the murmur swells into the promise of a different age. The shards of glass lie scattered still, sharp and glimmering in the light, and as our eyes rest upon them, we begin to hear another sound rising beyond the broken walls. It is the murmur of a restless world, a steady hum that grows louder with each passing year, for the 1920s have arrived, and with them a tide of transformations. The war has ended, though its shadows linger. Cities swell with new life, automobiles roar through the streets, women cut their hair short and step boldly into spaces once barred to them. Jazz trembles through dance halls, and the young, restless and impatient seize upon each new fashion as if to distance themselves from the grief and silence left by the years of war. Into this world, Barbara Castleton carried the fragments of her past, the glow of her career still present yet fragile, her name still whispered but no longer shouted. The cinema itself was changing as swiftly as the streets outside, no longer confined to modest studios with skylights and hand-cranked cameras. The industry was building palaces of dreams, theaters adorned with velvet curtains, chandeliers, and gilded balconies. Films grew longer, more ambitious, more daring in their storytelling. Stars were fashioned with deliberate care, their lives curated for public consumption, their images repeated until they seemed immortal. Barbara, who had once seemed part of this rising tide, now found herself in its eddies, her place less certain. The young faces of a new decade emerged with startling speed, actresses whose daring fashions and bold personalities suited the restless rhythm of the age. Barbara's composure, once admired as sincerity, began to seem like a relic of an earlier time. Still, she continued. Through the early years of the decade, she appeared in films, her beauty and talent undiminished, though the spotlight was beginning to shift elsewhere. Audiences, eager for novelty, often overlooked the steady grace she offered, the very qualities that had set her apart. Her calmness, her restraint, her quiet sincerity no longer shone so brightly in a culture hungry for extravagance, for flapper dresses and jazz-fueled energy. It is not that Barbara changed, but that the world changed around her, and in its rush it left little room for subtler lights. One cannot help but imagine her walking onto a studio lot in those years, passing younger actresses whose names were already shouted by fans. Did she feel their eyes upon her, respectful yet tinged with impatience, as if to say, "Your time is passing, and ours is beginning"? Or did she, with her characteristic serenity, pay no heed, content to continue her work quietly, without the desperate grasp for attention that consumed so many? The truth, as always, is hidden, but the image is clear. Barbara, luminous yet understated, moving steadily through a world that seemed determined to run faster and louder. Her personal life, too, carried its weight. The marriage to Willard Mack, fragile as glass, did not provide lasting shelter. Their quarrels and reconciliations, whispered about in gossip columns, became another reminder that even in her private life, stability eluded her. Alone again, she faced a decade that demanded reinvention, a decade that did not easily forgive those who could not adapt. For actresses of her generation, the 1920s were both opportunity and threat. Some soared to new heights, becoming immortal icons, while others, just as talented, quietly faded into the background, remembered only by those who had once admired them in darkened theaters. The broader world reflected this tension. The 1920s were an age of dazzling light and hidden fragility, of skyscrapers rising and markets swelling, but also of cracks forming beneath the surface. It was a world drunk on speed and novelty, eager to forget the pain of war, but already sowing the seeds of another kind of silence to come. Barbara, standing at the edge of this current, seemed almost symbolic. A woman whose career had been built upon silence, now facing a decade defined by its noise. And yet, within this noise, silent cinema still thrived for a time. Great directors pushed the art to its peak, creating works of extraordinary beauty and depth. Barbara appeared in several such productions, her name still present, her performances still admired, but the center of gravity was shifting. The public adored the bold new stars, actresses who laughed loudly, who danced wildly, who embodied the restless spirit of the age. Barbara's calm presence, her gentle sincerity seemed almost too still for such a world. She belonged to an earlier moment when audiences had leaned forward in reverent silence, marveling at the flicker of moving images. Now they demanded more, louder, faster, brighter. It is tempting to see in Barbara's life the story of the decade itself. The fragments of glass that marked her marriage reflect the fragility of an age glittering with wealth and invention, yet always vulnerable to collapse. The serenity that had once been her gift became, in a world of jazz and speed, almost a burden, as if she carried a silence the age no longer wished to hear. And yet, there is dignity in this. For while others clamored for attention, she remained true to herself, her stillness unbroken, her sincerity intact. I imagine her at a theater premiere, seated among the audience, her own face glowing from the screen as music plays. Around her, the crowd is restless, laughing, whispering, eager for excitement. She watches them as much as they watch her, sensing the shift in their attention, the way their eyes stray toward novelty, the way their admiration has grown less certain. Does she feel sorrow or only acceptance? Perhaps she understands that fame is never permanent, that to be celebrated for a season is already more than most receive. Perhaps she recognizes that her moment, though fading, has left a trace that cannot entirely vanish. The 1920s carried Barbara forward, but not upward. She moved through them like a steady figure in a rushing crowd, luminous but no longer central, present but not dominant. The world was changing and she could not change with it. Yet in her stillness, she offers us something rare, a reminder that dignity need not depend upon applause, that grace can endure even in obscurity. The murmur of voices grows louder now, swelling into something more than conversation. From behind the curtain comes another sound. Not applause, not laughter, but something new, something uncanny. It is the sound of a human voice carried through machinery, amplified and projected into the air. The talking picture is arriving, and with it a revolution that will sweep away the world Barbara has known. The murmur behind the curtain swells until it becomes unmistakable, no longer the restless shifting of an audience, but the resonance of a human voice, captured by machinery and set loose in the air. At first it seems a marvel, uncanny in its clarity, a ghost speaking not in silence but in full tone. The talking picture has arrived, and with it the fragile balance of the silent world begins to tremble. What once seemed complete, the language of glances, of gestures, of expressions framed in light, suddenly feels incomplete. The silence that carried Barbara Castleton's career, that defined her art, is no longer enough. A new age has begun, and its demand is simple but merciless. Speak or vanish. For Barbara, as for so many of her peers, this transition was perilous. The world of cinema had been built upon the universal language of expression, understood by all regardless of tongue. A woman in Arkansas, a man in Paris, a family in Buenos Aires, each could watch the same reel and read its meaning in silence. Now, with the addition of sound, language fractured that universality. The American voice, with its accents and cadences, would define success or failure. Some actors, beloved in silence, found their voices ill-suited to the microphone, too shrill, too thick, too unpolished. Others discovered that the mystery which silence had lent them dissolved when their words were heard. For an actress like Barbara, whose gift lay in serenity and restraint, the sudden insistence on audible presence may have been less a liberation than an intrusion. There are no surviving accounts of Barbara's voice, no recording that allows us to know its timbre. Did she sound gentle, measured, her tones carrying the same calm as her expressions? Or was her voice ordinary, unremarkable, unable to carry the weight of drama in a new medium? We cannot say, and therein lies the poignancy of her fate. For without sound she was luminous. With sound, she disappears. It is as if the invention of voice itself silenced her. The studios moved quickly. By the late 1920s, silence was already fading. Audiences demanded novelty, and sound gave it to them. Films were now spectacles of song and speech, bustling with dialogue, laughter, even shouted quarrels. The magic of stillness, once so powerful, seemed suddenly quaint. Barbara's performances, praised for their subtlety, no longer matched the expectations of a world intoxicated by noise. Her career, already delicate, could not withstand the weight of such change. Slowly, almost without notice, her name slipped from the credits, her image from the magazines. The curtain did not fall with a crash, but with a whisper, as if her art simply dissolved into the air. How must it have felt to watch the industry she had helped build evolve beyond her? To sit in a theater and hear voices where once there had only been silence, to realize that the craft she had given herself to was now considered obsolete. Perhaps she felt bitterness, perhaps sorrow, or perhaps only resignation. After all, Barbara had been born in 1894, the same year cinema itself took its first breath. She and the silent screen were twins of a kind, rising together, maturing together. Was it not fitting, then, that when cinema abandoned its silence, it also abandoned her? Her story was not unique. Entire generations of silent actors and actresses faded with the coming of sound. Some had voices unsuited to recording, others lacked the diction demanded by dialogue, still others simply could not adapt to the new style of acting. Silent cinema had required grandeur of gesture, subtlety of gaze, eloquence without speech. Talking pictures required a different craft altogether, one closer to the stage but filtered through microphones and amplifiers. The transition was brutal in its speed. Careers that had taken a decade to build collapsed in a single season. Barbara's was among them, and like many, she slipped into obscurity. Her silence no longer an art, but a void. And yet, there is something strangely dignified in her vanishing. Unlike those who struggled, who tried desperately to reinvent themselves in sound only to be ridiculed, Barbara faded quietly. She did not cling to the spotlight as it turned away, did not distort herself to fit a new mold. Instead, she accepted the silence, this time not as a language of art, but as the condition of obscurity. Perhaps this acceptance was itself her final performance, a gesture of serenity carried beyond the screen. I think often of what it means to be silenced by sound. Barbara's entire career had been built upon the absence of voice, upon the eloquence of gesture. In a way, she had taught audiences how to read silence, how to see emotion in stillness. And then, in an instant, the world declared that silence inadequate. She, who had once been praised for her restraint, was now invisible. It is a cruel irony, and yet it seems almost poetic, that her career ended not with scandal or disgrace, but with the simple fact of silence, overtaken by noise. Her personal life, too, shifted in these years. Removed from the screen, she faced the world as a woman no longer illuminated by fame. The gossip that had once surrounded her quieted. The scandals of her marriages became old stories, replaced by newer, louder tales of other stars. For the first time in years, Barbara was left to herself, no longer pursued by whispers, no longer defined by headlines. Obscurity, painful as it was, may also have brought her peace. In silence she had lived, in silence she had acted, and now, in silence, she endured. The voice that fades now leaves behind not emptiness, but loneliness. For silence in the theater had once been shared, an intimacy between screen and audience. Now Barbara's silence became private, isolating, a solitude not chosen, but imposed. The audience no longer leaned forward to read her eyes, no longer held their breath at her gestures. They turned instead to the voices of new stars, voices that sang and shouted, voices that filled the space where her silence had once reigned. And so the sound of human speech continues, swelling, multiplying, filling theaters with noise. Barbara's voice, if it was ever captured, is lost. Her image fades from the reels, her name from the newspapers. What remains is the memory of her serenity, a memory already fragile, already dissolving. Silence, once her gift, now becomes her exile. The voice fades into stillness, leaving the theater strangely empty. The crowd departs, murmuring of other stars, other marvels. Barbara sits alone in the darkness, unseen, unheard. Outside, the night is quiet, and within that quiet there is no applause, no gossip, no acclaim. Only silence, deep and final. And from that silence comes the slow, aching weight of loneliness, pressing like a hand upon the heart. The silence within the theater deepens, and from it rises the heaviness of loneliness, like a fog that settles across an abandoned street after midnight. The crowd has departed, their voices carried elsewhere, leaving Barbara Castleton alone in a world that no longer turns toward her. This is the beginning of her quiet years, when the glow of the screen no longer reflected her face, when the chatter of newspapers no longer carried her name. Fame, once so bright and restless, now withdrew as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the faint echo of memory. To live through such a shift is to feel the air itself change, as if the very world that once embraced you has decided to move on without farewell. Barbara's career in the silent cinema had given her a kind of immortality, or so it had seemed at the time. Her image was projected larger than life, her face seen by countless eyes, her silence filling rooms with eloquence. Yet with the coming of sound and the relentless march of novelty, she found herself displaced, her art dismissed as outdated, her presence forgotten. The quiet years were not merely the absence of work, they were the absence of recognition, the peculiar sorrow of being unseen after once being everywhere. For an ordinary life, obscurity is the norm, but for one who has known fame, obscurity is a kind of exile. What did she do in these years, removed from the machinery of studios and the gaze of audiences? We know little. The record grows thin, dissolving into fragments. It is possible she sought other pursuits or lived quietly in comfort from what she had earned. It is possible she struggled with finances or endured the restless dissatisfaction that often follows fame. Without her own words, we are left only with speculation. Yet the very absence of detail speaks to the truth of obscurity. She was no longer considered worth recording. Historians, biographers, journalists turned their attention to others, leaving Barbara's story to fade like an image on a screen that has lost its light. There is, in this fading, a kind of universality. For though Barbara's circumstances were particular to her era and her art, the experience of being forgotten is something all lives encounter. Each of us, in time, will be remembered less, our names spoken more rarely, our stories dimming. Barbara lived this truth more quickly, more visibly, for fame hastened both her rise and her fall. What took others decades to learn, she learned in the span of a few years, that the world does not linger on any one figure for long. The silent audience that once adored her moved on to others, and she, left behind, entered the long quiet of obscurity. Perhaps she found solace in this stillness. Perhaps she walked through gardens, listening to birdsong instead of applause, or sat in a quiet room, reading by lamplight, enjoying a privacy she had not known in her years of fame. There is dignity in retreat, a peace in withdrawing from the noise of the world, yet one cannot entirely dismiss the sorrow that may have accompanied it. To have been visible, to have been admired, and then to vanish is to feel the fragility of human recognition. Fame is like a candle, brilliant when lit, but leaving darkness when it burns away. I imagine her in these years as a woman who had learned to live with silence in new ways. Once she had commanded it on the screen, filling it with meaning. Now she inhabited it in daily life, the silence of obscurity, of unrecorded days. Friends may have still remembered her, neighbors may have greeted her warmly, but the larger world had forgotten. The cinema, that great engine of memory, had moved on to other stars, leaving Barbara among the unremembered. In this, her life mirrors the fate of the silent films themselves, so many of which decayed or were destroyed, their reels reduced to ash or dust. Just as her art vanished, so did her presence, both dissolving into the same oblivion. Yet even here, in the quiet years, there is a strange beauty. For what is obscurity but a return to the ordinary, the shared condition of all lives? Barbara, once lifted into light, now returned to the same rhythm as those who had once admired her. She became, once again, a woman among women, a life among lives, her days no longer magnified but lived in their own simplicity. There is humility in this and perhaps a form of grace. Fame had made her extraordinary, but obscurity allowed her to be human again. The abandoned cinema hall is the image that best reflects this chapter. Dust settles on empty seats, sunlight filters through high windows, the screen stands blank and silent. The grandeur of performance is gone, replaced by stillness. Yet within that stillness lies memory. The echo of applause, the shimmer of faces once projected, the ghost of Barbara's serene expression. The hall is empty, but not entirely. It holds the shadows of what once was, just as Barbara's quiet years held the memory of her earlier fame. We leave her there, seated perhaps in a quiet room, her days unrecorded, her name unspoken. The world has turned away, but she remains, living through the silence with the same composure she once carried on screen. The curtain is drawn, the lights are dim, and Barbara Castleton enters the long, still chapter of her life that history scarcely noticed. The dust continues to settle, soft and unhurried, on the rows of empty seats. From the silence comes the faint creak of wood, the sound of time itself pressing down. And in that sound, we hear the beginning of what follows, the exile of obscurity, the slow retreat into shadows from which few return. The dust upon the empty seats lingers, settling like a soft shroud over velvet cushions and carved wood, and from this image we are drawn into the deeper hush of exile. For obscurity is not merely absence, it is a kind of banishment, a quiet dismissal by the world that once held you in its gaze. Barbara Castleton, who had once commanded attention in darkened halls, now passed into this other country, the land of the unremembered. Her name, once spoken in admiration, grew fainter with each passing year, until it was mentioned only rarely, and then often with hesitation, as if those who recalled her were unsure of their own memory. The retreat from fame is never a single moment. It is not a door closing with finality, but rather a series of small withdrawals, each one less visible than the last. A film roll that once would have been hers goes to another. A photograph once printed in a magazine is replaced by a newer face. Invitations to premieres arrive less often than not at all. The telephone rings with decreasing frequency. One day she wakes and realizes that weeks, perhaps months, have passed without her name appearing in print. The exile has already begun, and she has slipped into it without ceremony. What did she feel in these years? Perhaps she welcomed the stillness, tired of the scrutiny and the gossip that had once surrounded her. Perhaps she longed for anonymity, for the chance to walk unrecognized through streets, to sit unnoticed in restaurants, to live without the constant weight of others' opinions. But it is also possible that she felt loss, a hollow ache where applause had once filled her. Fame may be fickle, but it leaves a mark, and when it vanishes, the emptiness it creates is real. The exile of obscurity is not simply the absence of noise. It is the presence of silence, where once there had been sound. Her personal circumstances are hard to trace. The records grow thinner, her life less documented. We know she left the industry, that her marriage to Willard Mack did not endure, that she lived apart from the light that once surrounded her. Beyond that, we must imagine. Did she return to Arkansas, to the quiet streets where she had been born? Did she remain in New York or California, lingering near the industry even as it turned away from her? Did she live in comfort or in modesty, her fortunes preserved or diminished? History does not tell us. But perhaps the uncertainty is itself fitting, for obscurity erases detail, leaving only faint outlines where once there had been clarity. The exile was not hers alone. She was one among many silent stars who vanished when the new age of sound arrived. Their photographs filled the pages of magazines one year, only to disappear the next, replaced by younger, louder, more fashionable faces. Some tried to fight against the tide, attempting to adapt, to reinvent themselves. Others accepted the change with dignity, retreating quietly into private lives. Barbara seems to have belonged to the latter, fading without resistance, her serenity intact even in disappearance. There is a certain nobility in such retreat, though it does not spare one from sorrow. We might think of her life at this time as a house with its curtains drawn. Within, she moves through ordinary routines, rising, dressing, preparing meals, writing letters, receiving occasional visitors. Outside, the world rushes on, unaware of her presence. She watches from the window, perhaps, seeing new fashions, new stars, new voices rising in popularity. The applause that once belonged to her now belongs to others, and she listens to it faintly, like a sound carried on the wind from a distant place. She is both near and far, both present and absent. This is the essence of exile. To live within the world, but no longer belong to its memory. Yet exile is not always bitter. In the stillness, Barbara may have found a new kind of freedom. She was no longer bound by contracts, no longer subject to the relentless demands of studios. She could live as she chose, speak when she wished, remain silent when she preferred. For a woman who had built her art upon silence, perhaps there was some comfort in reclaiming it on her own terms. The silence of obscurity was not chosen, but within it she might have discovered moments of peace, moments when she could simply be herself without performance, without expectation. Still, the weight of loss cannot be denied. To have once lived in the brightness of fame, and then to see that brightness extinguished, is to carry a shadow. Barbara's life in these years remains veiled, and so we are left to imagine the emotions that must have accompanied her exile. Regret, perhaps, for what might have been had sound not arrived. Relief, perhaps, for the end of scrutiny. Loneliness, surely, for the absence of applause. Pride, perhaps, for the work she had done, even if it was now forgotten. All of these may have coexisted, weaving together into the fabric of her days. The image that lingers is of a door closing softly, shutting out the noise of the world, leaving only stillness inside. Barbara Castleton, once luminous upon the screen, now lived in this stillness, an exile not by choice but by history. Yet even in exile there is memory. The films she made, though many are lost, carried her face to countless eyes. The applause she received once filled theaters. The whispers of her name once traveled through streets. These cannot be erased entirely. They remain as faint echoes, as shadows in the dust of the empty hall. The door remains closed, the room quiet, the figure within almost invisible. And then, from the silence, comes the faint hiss of something burning, something fragile dissolving into smoke. For just as Barbara herself was fading from memory, so too were the films that had preserved her. The reels, fragile as they were, began to decay, to crumble, to vanish. The exile was not hers alone. It was shared by her art, which slipped away with her, leaving behind only traces. The faint hiss of burning reaches the ear now, not the comforting crackle of a hearth, but the more fragile and unsettling sound of nitrate film meeting the slow destruction of time. Silent films, those delicate ribbons of image and light, were never made to endure. Their very material was unstable, prone to crumbling into dust, or more tragically, to igniting into flame with a suddenness that consumed entire reels in minutes. Barbara Castleton's work, carried on those fragile strips, faced this fate alongside the work of her peers. What once brought her presence into theaters across the nation slowly dissolved, until entire films existed no longer in any archive, no longer even in fragments, but only in the uncertain memory of those who had seen them. The loss of silent cinema is one of history's quieter tragedies. Thousands of films vanished before preservation was considered, their stories gone, their images irretrievable. To think of Barbara is to think also of this vanishing, for her career is mirrored by the fragility of her medium. Just as she herself slipped into obscurity, so too did the films that carried her. The art that made her name known was built upon a foundation that could not withstand time, and as it dissolved, so did her remembrance. To be forgotten twice, once as a person and again as an image, is a sorrow few deserve, yet many silent stars endured. We may imagine the vaults where reels were stored, rooms filled with metal canisters stacked high, each holding within it the flicker of human lives. Some were preserved, others discarded. Fires broke out in storage houses, consuming years of work in sudden conflagrations. In one moment, entire chapters of cinema's infancy were erased. Among them may have been films in which Barbara appeared, performances that had once stirred audiences now gone forever. What does it mean, then, to speak of her art, when the very evidence of it no longer survives? It means that we speak of shadows, of echoes, of something glimpsed and then lost. It means that we rely upon the faint traces left in newspaper reviews, in photographs, in scattered clippings that preserve not the art itself, but only the impression it made. This fragility deepens the poignancy of her story. For Barbara was born in the same year as cinema itself, and her life ran parallel to its early decades. To see her art vanish with the reels is to see her life entwined completely with that medium, as if her fate could not be separated from it. When the reels decayed, so too did the memory of her presence. She was bound to the silence of film, and when that silence was no longer valued, she was bound also to its disappearance. And yet, memory is not entirely erased. In scattered archives, in collections of silent film enthusiasts, in dusty boxes preserved by accident rather than intention, a reel or a fragment may survive. Somewhere, perhaps, lies a film in which Barbara appears, her serene expression flickering once again upon a screen. The possibility that such fragments endure reminds us that her story is not entirely lost, that in the vast sea of vanished reels, a few may yet carry her light. This hope, however faint, offers her a measure of immortality, an immortality not of certainty, but of possibility. The memory of film is not only in reels, but in the minds of those who once watched them. Imagine an audience member from 1917, perhaps a young woman who walked into a small-town theater one summer evening. She watched Barbara Castleton upon the screen, saw her eyes glance upward in sorrow, saw her hands clasped in hope. That viewer carried the memory into her own life, perhaps recalling it years later in conversation, perhaps telling her children of the silent films she once loved. Though the reel itself may be lost, the impression remained for a time, passed through stories and recollections, until even those faded. Yet for a few decades, Barbara lived on in such memories, her presence transmitted not by film but by human voice. What does it mean to be remembered in this way, indirectly, tenuously? It means to become a ghost in the collective imagination, a name half recalled, a face dimly remembered. The memory of film is like smoke, shapeless, drifting, fragile. And yet smoke carries a scent, a trace that lingers even after the flame is gone. Barbara's life is such a trace, faint, elusive, but not entirely absent. There is a sorrow in knowing that we cannot see her performances as they once were. We cannot sit in darkness and watch her speak through silence, cannot hear the faint notes of a piano accompanying her gestures. We must imagine it, reconstruct it from fragments, trust in the descriptions left behind. This absence, however, gives her story its poignancy. For what is more haunting than a performance we cannot witness, a life recorded yet erased, a presence glimpsed but unreachable? Barbara becomes, in this sense, not only an actress but a symbol of loss itself, a reminder of the fragility of memory. The hiss of burning film fades, leaving only a wisp of smoke drifting in the air. It curls upward, vanishing into the night, carrying with it the last remnants of images we can no longer see. In that smoke, we glimpse Barbara's face for a moment, serene as always, then gone. The reel has ended, the memory dissolved, the silence complete. And yet, from the smoke, another image takes shape. The echo of footsteps in an empty studio lot, a figure walking through shadows long after the cameras have ceased to turn. Barbara Castleton, ghost of Hollywood, moves through the silence, her presence felt even when unseen. The smoke curls upward, fading into the night, and in its vanishing we begin to sense the echo of footsteps upon an empty studio lot. The sound is faint as though carried from another time, hollow against the walls of buildings long since abandoned or rebuilt. Here, in this place once alive with lights and laughter, Barbara Castleton walks as a ghost, not of malice or terror, but of memory. She belongs to an era that Hollywood itself chose to forget, and in that forgetting, she lingers in the margins, present, yet unseen. For Hollywood, though it thrives on dreams, is ruthless with its past. It remembers only those names that serve its narrative of progress, those stars who can be reshaped into myth. The rest are cast aside, their images lost, their lives overlooked. Barbara was one of these. Once visible, then discarded, her light extinguished without ceremony. To call her a ghost is not to suggest haunting, but rather to suggest presence without recognition. She exists in photographs, in fragments of film reviews, in scattered mentions within histories of the silent era. She exists in the eyes of those who once saw her, though they too have passed. She exists here now, as we speak her name again. But in the streets of Hollywood itself, among the studios and theaters that once echoed with her presence, there is no monument to Barbara Castleton. She drifts in silence, overshadowed by the names of those whose legends were preserved. The nature of Hollywood memory has always been selective. It preserves those who can be molded into symbols, the girl-next-door innocence of Mary Pickford, the sultry allure of Theda Bara, the tragic brilliance of Clara Bow. But Barbara's qualities, serenity, restraint, quiet dignity, did not lend themselves to such easy myth-making. She was admired in her time, but she did not embody a narrative that Hollywood could retell for decades to come. and so she was forgotten, her image fading, her story untold. This forgetting is as much a choice as it is a consequence, for memory in Hollywood is crafted, curated, and Barbara was left outside that curation. Yet to imagine her ghost walking the lot is to imagine her witnessing all that followed. The arrival of sound, the glitter of the 1930s musicals, the wartime dramas, the film noir shadows, the Technicolor dreams. She would have seen her art eclipsed, her silence drowned beneath the voices of others. Did she ever walk those streets in life, years after her career had ended, passing by theaters that now celebrated new stars? Did she feel the ache of absence, the strangeness of knowing she too had once belonged to that world, and now it belonged to others? We cannot know, but the image endures. A woman moving quietly through the shadows of Hollywood, unseen, her past invisible to those who rushed past her. Ghosts, after all, are not always remnants of tragedy. Sometimes they are reminders, whispers that ask us to remember what has been lost. Barbara's ghost, if we allow ourselves to see it, reminds us of all the forgotten lives that built the foundation of cinema. Without them, the industry could not have risen. Without their performances, their presence, their sacrifices, the art could not have grown. Yet because their names were not preserved, we speak of them rarely, as if they never existed. Barbara stands among them, her serenity marking her not only as a silent star, but also as a silent witness to the fate of those who came before the myth of Hollywood fully hardened. Her life in this way becomes symbolic. She represents not only herself, but the countless others whose careers were brief, whose fame was fragile, whose art has been lost. She becomes the embodiment of cinema's own cruelty, its ability to enthrall with one hand and erase with the other. To call her forgotten is not to diminish her, but to acknowledge the truth of how memory functions in a world that thrives on spectacle. She was forgotten not because she lacked worth, but because the industry moved on, choosing noise over silence, speed over stillness. There is also tenderness in this ghostly image, for in walking the empty lot, Barbara is not entirely gone. She remains in the air, in the shadows, in the faint echoes of voices and laughter that once filled those spaces. Ghosts are not erased, they are overlooked. To see Barbara again, to speak of her again, is to lift her from invisibility, to grant her a moment of remembrance. Perhaps this is all she requires, not immortality, not fame renewed, but a recognition that she lived, that she shone, that she mattered. The footsteps in the lot continue, slow and steady, carrying her past doors once marked with her name, past sound stages where she once stood in costume, past offices where contracts were signed and discarded. The air is heavy with silence, broken only by her unseen passage. She does not seek attention. She does not cry out. She simply walks, serene as always, as if she belongs still, even if no one else acknowledges it. This ghost of Hollywood reminds us, too, of our own forgetting, for we are quick to celebrate the bright, the loud, the monumental, but slow to honor the subtle, the quiet, the modest. Barbara's art was of stillness and restraint, qualities that do not linger easily in memory, yet they are no less valuable. Her ghost walks not only in Hollywood, but in our own minds, asking us to consider what we overlook, what we discard, what we fail to remember. The echo of her footsteps fades, dissolving once more into silence. The lot is empty again, the air still. But just as silence holds memory, so too does this emptiness. In it, we feel the passing of an era, the decline of silent cinema, the vanishing of lives once luminous. Barbara's ghost steps away into the shadows, and in her absence we see the broader truth, that her fate was not unique, that she was one among many swept aside by change. She vanishes into the dark, and in her place the credits of a final silent film roll across the screen, names glowing for a moment before the light goes out. The credits roll upward in silence, names drifting across the screen like leaves carried by a slow current. And then the light dims. The screen goes black. The theater is left in shadow, and from that shadow arises the sense of an ending, far larger than one life alone. For Barbara, Castleton's fading was not hers in isolation. It was part of the greater vanishing of an age, the slow retreat of silent cinema into memory. What she endured was what many endured, the displacement of an entire generation of performers whose art, once praised, became obsolete almost overnight. To speak of Barbara in these years is to speak of the passing of an era, of the closing of a chapter in which silence itself had been enough. Silent cinema had reached its greatest heights in the 1920s, producing films of beauty and depth that remain admired even now. Directors refined the language of moving images. Stars embodied archetypes that resonated across nations, and audiences continued to fill theaters in awe. Yet, as sound emerged, the silent form was abandoned with startling speed. Studios retooled, theaters installed speakers, scripts were rewritten, and actors were tested for their voices. Some survived this transition, but many more were swept away. Barbara was one among them, and her disappearance reflects the broader fate of her generation. What had once been the pinnacle of artistry was dismissed as archaic, as quaint, as unfinished. The art that had enthralled millions was now treated as a curiosity, something to be remembered with nostalgia, but no longer embraced with passion. The performers who had carried this art bore the brunt of this change. Men and women who had devoted themselves to the craft of silent expression suddenly found themselves unwanted. Some turned to the stage, others left the industry entirely. A few endured in minor roles, but the majority vanished. Their faces, once luminous, became forgotten. Barbara's serenity, her subtlety, her gift for silence, all of it became irrelevant in a world that demanded voices. She was not alone in this, but her story embodies it with particular poignancy, for she had been praised precisely for the qualities that sound discarded. To lose one's career not through failure but through change itself is a tragedy of a different kind, not the fall of an individual, but the erasure of a form of art. This passing of an era was felt not only by the performers, but also by the audiences. Those who had grown up with silent film, who had been moved by its eloquence, suddenly found themselves watching a different kind of cinema. The intimacy of silence was replaced by the clamor of dialogue and song. The shared stillness of the theater, once filled only by the whir of the projector and the soft notes of a pianist, gave way to noise. Some rejoiced in the novelty, others lamented what was lost, but the tide could not be reversed. Barbara's disappearance reflects this shift not only in art, but in culture itself, a turning away from quietness, from suggestion, from subtlety, toward an age of volume and certainty. In remembering Barbara, we also remember the many unnamed, the countless actors and actresses whose names no longer echo in our memory. Together they formed the fabric of the silent screen. Together they gave life to stories now lost. Their vanishing is not only personal, but collective, a reminder that art itself is fragile, subject to the winds of change, to the demands of novelty. Barbara's life becomes a lens through which we see this broader truth. She is one name, but she represents many. And yet, within this passing, there is also continuity. The art of cinema did not die with silence. It transformed. The techniques developed in the silent era, the close-up, the montage, the emphasis on visual storytelling, continued to shape film even after sound arrived. Barbara's work, though forgotten, contributed to this foundation. Her presence upon the screen, her performances in silent dramas, were part of the collective experiment that gave cinema its language. To remember her is to remember that the silent era was not merely a prologue but an essential chapter, without which the later glories could not exist. The image that lingers is of a theater where the final silent film has just ended. The audience stirs, uncertain, aware that something has concluded. Outside, the world is already noisy, filled with radios and automobiles, with jazz bands and chatter. Inside, the silence of the screen feels both profound and vulnerable, as if it knows it is about to be abandoned. Barbara, standing within this silence, becomes a symbol of its fragility. Her career, like the silent era itself, was luminous but fleeting, destined to vanish not through failure, but through the inexorable march of change. There is sorrow in this passing, but there is also beauty. For what is an era if not a moment shared by many, lived intensely, then left behind? Barbara's era was brief, but it was filled with light, with applause, with the intimacy of silence shared by audiences across the world. To mourn its passing is to recognize its value. To speak of Barbara now, after so many decades, is to honor not only her, but the entire generation she represents. The screen is dark now, the credits ended, the light extinguished. The audience has left and the theater is empty. In this emptiness lies both loss and memory. For though the era has passed, though Barbara and her peers have faded, their presence lingers like the afterimage of light upon closed eyes. The silence is deep, but within it we still hear the faint echoes of their performances, the distant applause, the ghost of cinema's infancy. The blackness of the screen endures, and into it we stare, waiting. Out of that blackness comes the sound of a pen scratching across paper, steady and deliberate. It is the sound of writing, of letters formed, of words recorded. The silence gives way to this small, intimate act, and in it we find the beginning of another chapter. Barbara not as actress, but as a woman withdrawing into her private life, leaving the screen behind and folding her days into the quietness of the ordinary. The sound of the pen continues, scratching softly across paper, a rhythm steady and faint, like the murmur of a tide against the shore. It is the sound of someone writing letters, notes, perhaps even entries in a diary, words destined for a drawer rather than a headline. Barbara Castleton, who had once been projected upon silver screens for audiences across the nation, was now writing only for herself or for a few trusted correspondents, her life removed from the currents of fame. The screen no longer held her. The reels had ceased to turn. What remained was a life lived in privacy, a retreat from the world of performance into the quiet corridors of the everyday. To leave behind the screen is not to leave behind the memory of it. Even in her quiet years, Barbara must have carried within her the knowledge of what she had once been. She had stood in front of cameras, moved through painted sets, performed stories that stirred strangers in the dark. She had lived within applause, within gossip, within the peculiar radiance of fame. To step away from all of this was to step into another world, one that did not measure life in roles or reviews, but in the small patterns of daily existence. Yet the transition cannot have been simple. The silence of private life is deeper than the silence of film, for it offers no audience, no echo, no reassurance that one's gestures are seen. In these years, Barbara's presence upon the stage of history fades almost entirely. We do not know where she lived, what rooms she inhabited, what friends she kept. The records are thin, scattered, unwilling to preserve the life of one who had been deemed no longer relevant. This absence is itself a kind of testimony. For the film industry, so attentive to its stars in their brightness, had no interest in them once their light dimmed. Barbara became invisible to the world, her story unwritten, her voice unheard. The pen that scratched upon paper belonged only to her now, and if she confided her thoughts to those pages, they too have been lost. What was she like in these final years? Perhaps she lived in modest comfort, her savings sufficient to sustain her. Perhaps she relied upon family or upon friends, her fortunes less secure than they had once seemed. Did she walk in gardens? Did she keep photographs from her screen life? Did she attend the theater now only as a spectator? The truth is veiled, but the questions themselves carry meaning. For in asking them, we recognize that Barbara was not only a star, but a person, a woman whose life stretched beyond the narrow frame of her fame. There is a certain dignity in such withdrawal. To walk away from the noise of the world, to dwell in silence without protest, is a choice few can make with grace. Barbara, who had built her art upon silence, seems to have accepted it once more as her companion. She no longer sought applause, no longer sought recognition. She lived as countless others lived, her days unrecorded, her actions unremarked. Yet within this obscurity lies a form of peace, a chance to rest after years of exposure. Fame is a fire, and once extinguished, it leaves only smoke. But in the quiet that follows, one may at last breathe freely. Still, the poignancy cannot be denied. To have been seen by so many and then to be seen by no one is a loss not easily borne. Perhaps Barbara felt it most when she looked at her reflection, older now, less like the serene figure once captured on film. Did she recall those days with pride, or with sorrow, or with a mixture of both? Did she feel that she had been fortunate to have known fame at all, or that she had been unfortunate to have lost it so soon? The silence offers no answer. The end of her screen life was not marked by farewell or by tribute. It ended quietly, without announcement, without applause. She simply ceased to appear. Her name ceased to be printed. Her image ceased to be circulated. For the world, this meant nothing. For her, it must have meant everything. To vanish in this way is to experience death before death, to see one's public self erased while the private self continues on. Barbara endured this with the same serenity she had always shown, a serenity that remains her most defining quality. The image that arises is of a woman seated at a desk, writing a letter by lamplight. The pen scratches softly, the room is quiet, the air filled only with the faint scent of ink and paper. Outside, the city moves on. Cars pass, voices rise, theaters glow with the names of others. But inside, there is stillness. And within that stillness, Barbara writes, not for the world, but for herself. This image, though imagined, feels true, for it captures the essence of her final years, the retreat from spectacle into intimacy, from noise into quiet. The letter is folded, the ink drying. She places it aside, perhaps never to be sent, perhaps meant for a friend who will one day open it and hear her voice in its lines. The gesture is small, but it carries weight, for it reminds us that even in obscurity, a life is lived, choices are made, words are written. Fame may vanish, but humanity does not. Barbara remained a woman of thought, of feeling, of presence, even when the world no longer acknowledged her. The sound of the pen fades, and in its place comes another sound, faint but resonant, the toll of a distant bell. It rings slowly, its vibrations lingering in the air, heavy with the sense of time passing, of endings approaching. The bell tolls for no one in particular, yet its sound draws us onward, reminding us that all stories move toward conclusion, all lives toward silence. Barbara's quiet years deepen now, and in their deepening we begin to sense the shadow of her final chapter. The toll of the bell reverberates slowly, its sound rolling outward into the stillness, fading yet lingering in the air like a vibration that does not wish to end. In that resonance, we step into the later years of Barbara Castleton, years that flicker faintly before us, lit not by the bright beams of fame, but by the softer, more intimate glow of private life. For though the world no longer spoke her name, though the newspapers had ceased to mention her, and the screens no longer projected her image, she continued, as all must, through the ordinary passage of days. These years are shadows to us, uncertain and unrecorded. The biographer finds little to grasp, the historian only fragments. Yet shadows have their own eloquence, and within them we may imagine the rhythm of her final decades. No longer an actress upon the screen, Barbara became again simply a woman, her life shaped not by roles or reviews, but by the private choices of companionship, of household, of routine. The great arcs of fame had ended. What remained was the smaller arc of living, rising each morning, watching seasons turn, marking the years in ways familiar to us all. Her second marriage to Willard Mack had not lasted. Its cracks, once whispered in gossip, grew into fractures that ended in separation. He went on with his restless career, while Barbara's path diverged into quietness. Alone again, she carried with her the weight of two broken unions, each a fragment of her life, each leaving its trace. Did she see them as failures or as lessons, or simply as chapters now closed? We cannot know, but surely they left her cautious, more guarded in her later relationships if she chose to seek them at all. For a woman once scrutinized by public eyes, the appeal of solitude might have been strong, the freedom of belonging to no one but herself. There is an image that comes to mind of Barbara in the 1930s and 1940s, when the film world had long since moved beyond her. She's older now, her hair darker or perhaps touched with silver, her face marked gently by the years. Yet the serenity of her expression remains, that same calmness seen in photographs from her youth. She walks through a garden or along a city street, unnoticed by those who pass her. They do not know that she was once luminous upon the screen, that her name once graced posters and programs. To them, she is simply another passerby, another figure in the crowd. There is both sorrow and grace in this anonymity, for it frees her even as it erases her. By the time the Second World War shook the world, Barbara was in her 40s, far removed from the industry that had defined her early life. She would have witnessed the newsreels, the blackouts, the rationing, the letters sent and received. She lived through an era when cinema itself was reshaped, when Hollywood turned to war stories and patriotic dramas. Did she go to theaters during those years, sitting in the dark as she once had commanded the screen? Did she feel a pang of memory as she watched others act where she once had stood? Perhaps. Or perhaps she had learned not to look backward, finding instead a quiet rhythm in the present. Her final years led her toward the city of New York, where she is believed to have resided. The metropolis, loud and unceasing, was a place where anonymity could be complete, where one might vanish into the current of life without trace. In that current, Barbara lived until 1951, her days largely unrecorded, her presence unnoticed by the larger world. When she died, it was without fanfare. There were no grand obituaries, no headlines, no ceremonies of remembrance. The newspapers that once printed her name in bold now made no mention of her passing. She slipped from life as quietly as she had once slipped from the screen, her end unremarked, save by those who knew her personally. And yet there is poignancy in this quiet death. For Barbara's life, like her art, was defined by silence. She had built her career upon the eloquence of wordless performance, upon the ability to move hearts without speech. When she faded from the screen, it was with the same silence. When she left the world, it was without sound or spectacle. This consistency gives her life a kind of poetic unity, as if silence itself was always her companion, her gift, and her fate. The flicker of her private life reminds us of the limits of memory. We can speak of her films, though most are lost. We can recall her beauty, though it fades from photographs. We can note her marriages, though their details dissolve in rumor. Beyond these, her life is largely unknown. Yet perhaps that is fitting, for to insist upon knowing more would be to break the dignity of her quietness, to demand from her what she did not choose to reveal. Her silence becomes her legacy, inviting us not to intrude but to reflect. In reflecting upon her end, we see not only Barbara, but all those who lived and were forgotten, the silent stars who shone for a season and then vanished, the countless men and women whose names once filled theaters but are now unread, They too lived through quiet years. They too faced unremarked deaths, their contributions dissolved into the obscurity of time. Barbara is their emblem, her story standing for theirs, her silence speaking for their silence. The toll of the bell fades now into the distance, leaving behind the hush of evening. The air is still, the light dim. Barbara's life has closed, her days complete, her presence withdrawn. The world does not notice, yet we notice, for we have paused to remember her. And in that remembering, she flickers once again, not as a star upon a screen, but as a figure in memory, serene, dignified, silent. The bell's vibration lingers just a moment longer, then dissolves into the whisper of wind across a quiet graveyard. Among the stones lies hers, unadorned, uncelebrated, but still bearing her name. The wind stirs fallen leaves, carrying them across the earth, and in their rustle we hear the continuation of her story, the silence of obscurity, the stillness of a life unremarked, yet not entirely gone. The whisper of the wind moves through the graveyard, stirring the fallen leaves, carrying them in slow spirals across the ground. They brush against the stones, some bearing names still remembered, others long unread, their letters softened by time and weather. Among them lies the resting place of Barbara Castleton, a name once bright upon silver screens, now carved in quiet upon stone. No crowds gather here, no admirers leave flowers, no reporters linger with pens in hand. Her death in 1951 passed largely unmarked, her life uncelebrated, her absence unnoticed by the world that had once adored her. The silence of obscurity settled upon her fully then, deeper than the silence of film, deeper than the silence of exile. This was the silence of finality, the quiet that comes when memory itself begins to fade. There is a kind of cruelty in this forgetting. To have been seen by thousands, to have been admired, whispered about, even envied, and then to pass from life without public acknowledgement is to feel the impermanence of fame in its starkest form. The applause that once rose for Barbara, the gossip that once swirled about her marriages, the admiration that once filled theaters, all of it dissolved by the time of her death. The newspapers did not commemorate her. The industry did not look back. She was gone, and the world did not pause to notice. Yet this is the fate of most who live in the bright glare of Hollywood's early years. The spotlight moves quickly, and when it shifts away, it seldom returns. The silence of obscurity is not entirely empty, however. Within it lies a strange dignity. For Barbara's life, once consumed by the noise of fame and the chatter of gossip, ended in quietness. She belonged again to herself, free of scrutiny, free of expectation. In her final years, she had lived not as a star, but as a woman, ordinary and unobserved. In death, she was spared the spectacle that often surrounds the passing of famous figures. She slipped away without intrusion, her departure as serene as her on-screen presence. There is humility in this, a gentleness that feels true to her character as we have glimpsed it through the fragments of her story. And yet to us who look back, her obscurity is poignant, for it reminds us of how easily lives are forgotten, how quickly memory fades, how fragile legacy can be. Barbara's silence speaks not only for herself, but for countless others, actors, actresses, artists, dreamers, whose contributions once mattered and then were erased. To reflect on her obscurity is to confront our own. How many of us will be remembered beyond our generation? How many of us will be spoken of decades after our passing? Barbara's life is a mirror, showing us the fleeting nature of recognition. The silence also belongs to her films. Just as she herself was forgotten, so too were the reels that carried her. Few, if any, of her works survive in full. Most have been lost to decay, to fire, to neglect. The stories she performed, the gestures she made, the serenity of her gaze, all vanished with the fragile nitrate that once bore them. To stand at her grave is to realize that both the woman and her art have been erased. their presence only faintly preserved in scattered records and fading photographs. She is doubly absent, absent as a person, absent as an artist. Her obscurity is complete, yet within it lies the haunting weight of what has been lost. Still, memory is not entirely gone. Even now, in speaking of her, we bring her back into view, if only faintly. To remember Barbara Castleton is to resist the silence that claimed her. It is to grant her a moment of visibility once more, to acknowledge that her life mattered, that her art touched others, even if we can no longer witness it ourselves. The silence of obscurity is powerful, but it is not absolute. Within it, there remains the possibility of rediscovery, of voices choosing to speak her name again. Perhaps there is comfort in this thought, that obscurity is not the end, but a pause. The past is filled with figures once forgotten and later remembered, their stories uncovered by chance, their names spoken anew. Barbara may yet be one of these, her films perhaps resurfacing in archives, her story retold by those who care for the silent era. Until then, she rests in quietness, her silence both her companion and her legacy. The graveyard remains still, the wind moving gently among the stones. The leaves settle again upon the earth, covering the names, concealing them further. Night approaches, and with it a deeper quiet. The silence of obscurity grows heavier, pressing down like a weight, but within it there is also stillness, peace, a sense of return. Barbara, who had once been a figure of light and noise, now belongs entirely to silence, her story folded into the larger silence of history. And yet, as we listen to that silence, we hear something else within it, a faint rustling, like the turning of pages, as though an old book were being closed and placed upon a shelf. Barbara's life has been set aside, her story forgotten, but the book remains. Dust gathers upon it, but within its pages her presence endures. The silence does not destroy it, it only conceals it, waiting for a hand to open it again. The whisper of the wind fades, replaced by the soft thud of a book being closed. Dust rises in the air, catching the last light of day, and in that dust we find the beginning of what comes next. The question of memory itself, of why we remember some and forget others, and what it means to bring a name like Barbara Castleton's back into speech. The book closes with a soft sound, a faint thud as it settles upon the shelf, and the dust rises in the air, drifting slowly in the last golden light of evening. In that moment, we are compelled to reflect, to ask why some books are taken down and read again, while others are left unopened, their stories unseen, their words forgotten. So it is with lives, for human memory functions like a vast library, selective and uneven, preserving some names in constant use while allowing others to fade into obscurity. Barbara Castleton's story asks us to linger with this question. Why do we remember certain figures while others, no less talented, no less luminous in their time, are left to vanish? Memory, after all, is not impartial. It is shaped by power, by narrative, by chance. Hollywood chose to preserve some of its stars, transforming them into myth, repeating their stories until they became legends. Mary Pickford as the eternal girl, Charlie Chaplin as the little tramp, Rudolph Valentino as the tragic lover. These names endure because they were useful to the industry's sense of itself, and because their images were maintained long after their careers ended. Barbara Castleton, by contrast, did not fit into such mythology. Her gift was subtlety. Her presence was serene, her story not easily adapted into the great narratives of triumph or tragedy. And so memory let her slip away, like a volume quietly placed back upon the shelf and left to gather dust. Yet to be forgotten does not mean to be unworthy of remembrance. Barbara's life carries its own meaning, not in the grandeur of legend, but in the fragility of existence, the quiet dignity of someone who lived through both fame and obscurity. Her story reminds us that memory is not an even field, that countless lives have been lived with brilliance and then lost to silence. To reflect on her is to confront our own assumptions about what matters, what endures, what is worthy of recall. Do we honor only those whose fame was loudest, or do we also make room for those whose light was gentler? The question of memory is also the question of permanence. Film itself was once thought impermanent, mere entertainment with no need for preservation. That so many reels of the silent era have been destroyed reflects this assumption. The industry did not believe that the work of Barbara Castleton and her peers would matter to future generations, and so it was discarded. Yet here we are, more than a century later, straining to reconstruct her story, longing to know what her performances were like, piecing together fragments from reviews and photographs. The very effort to remember her proves the failure of that earlier judgment. What was dismissed as trivial reveals itself to be deeply meaningful, a glimpse into lives and expressions that might still speak to us if only they had been preserved. But why do we seek memory at all? Perhaps it is because remembrance affirms existence. To recall Barbara Castleton now is to affirm that she lived, that she acted, that she mattered. Without memory, lives dissolve into nothingness, as if they had never been. With memory, however faint, they remain part of the human story. Barbara's obscurity is poignant not only because she was forgotten, but because we feel that she should not have been. To speak her name again is to resist the silence, to reopen the book, to breathe life once more into words that were left unread. And yet we must also face the truth. Most lives, even most luminous ones, will fade. This is not failure. It is the condition of time. Barbara's obscurity mirrors our own future, for we too will be forgotten in the centuries to come. Our names will be lost, our stories erased, our existence reduced to fragments if remembered at all. In this sense, to reflect on Barbara is to reflect on ourselves, to see in her silence the silence that awaits us all. The question of memory is therefore also the question of mortality. What does it mean to live, knowing that we will one day vanish from the world's recall? Perhaps the answer lies not in permanence, but in presence. Barbara's life mattered not because it endured in memory, but because it was lived. She acted, she loved, she endured, she existed in her time. For those who watched her films, for those who whispered her name, for those who knew her in person, she was real, she was vivid, she was here. The fact that we must reconstruct her now from fragments does not diminish that truth. Memory may fade, but existence leaves its trace, however faint. The dust upon the shelf still bears the weight of the book, the echo of its presence. To ask why Barbara was forgotten is to ask why we remember at all. Do we seek to preserve the extraordinary, or do we recognize the beauty of the ordinary as well? Barbara's story reminds us that even those who vanish left something behind, even if it is only the faint echo of their name. To reflect on her is to affirm that memory can be an act of care, a choice to honor what might otherwise be lost. The book rests upon the shelf still, its pages closed, its spine unread. Yet even as it gathers dust, it waits. Memory is never fully gone, it is only dormant, awaiting rediscovery. Barbara's story, in being told now, is proof of this. Though obscurity claimed her for decades, she is not entirely erased. She walks once more through our thoughts, her serenity visible again in words, if not in film. To remember her is to remind ourselves that memory itself is fragile, but also resilient, capable of revival. The dust in the air settles slowly, falling in motes of light, and in that light we glimpse another image, a shelf upon which the forgotten rest, their names faint, their stories closed, yet their presence not entirely gone. Among them, Barbara waits, and in opening her book again, we give her a second life. The dust drifts down, and as it settles, another image begins to rise, the faint shimmer of a star appearing in the night sky, fragile, flickering, yet visible once more. The dust settles softly, drifting down in faint shafts of light, and from its stillness there rises the shimmer of a star, long forgotten, yet faintly visible once more. It flickers not with the brilliance of the brightest constellations, not with the bold permanence of the immortalized names, but with a fragile persistence, a reminder that even forgotten lights may be seen again if one cares to look upward. So it is with Barbara Castleton. Though her films lie mostly lost, though her name fell from headlines decades ago, she has not been erased entirely. She is rediscovered in fragments, in scattered reviews and still photographs, in lists of credits from the silent era, in the diligent work of archivists and historians who refuse to let all memory vanish. Like a star glimpsed between clouds, she flickers, faint but real. The work of remembering such figures is quiet and patient. Archivists dig through old canisters, hoping to find reels mislabeled or left behind. Film enthusiasts seek out scraps of nitrate stored in basements, hidden away in forgotten collections. Historians turn the pages of yellowed newspapers, piecing together what once was. From their care emerges the faint outline of lives like Barbara's, reconstructed from fragments. A still image in which her gaze appears serene, a review praising her sincerity in a long-vanished melodrama, a mention in trade papers of her marriage, her performances, her withdrawal. Each fragment is like a shard of glass, and together they form a mosaic, not complete, not whole, but enough to glimpse her again. In this way, Barbara becomes a rediscovered star, not blazing in fame, but glowing faintly through memory's persistence. She reminds us that obscurity is not final, that what is forgotten can be recalled, that silence itself can be broken. To speak her name now is to join in that work of rediscovery, to bring her back into the present, however briefly, and to affirm that her life and her art still matter. There is tenderness in this act of remembrance, for to recall Barbara is not to resurrect fame in the noisy sense, not to thrust her into spectacle once more, but to honor her with gentleness, to acknowledge her presence with care. She is not returned to gossip or to scandal, but to dignity. We see her not as a curiosity, but as a human being, one who lived, who acted, who endured both the light of fame and the shadow of obscurity. In remembering her, we grant her what Hollywood did not: continuity, respect, a place within history. The rediscovered star also reminds us of how fragile memory is. It depends upon chance, upon the survival of reels, upon the persistence of researchers, upon the willingness of audiences to look back. Without these, Barbara's name might vanish entirely, her presence lost to time. That she remains at all is a miracle of fragments, a testament to the resilience of memory even in the face of neglect. She is fragile, but she endures, like starlight that travels across centuries to reach our eyes. To imagine Barbara as a star is fitting, for stars too are contradictions, brilliant and distant, visible and unreachable, present yet untouchable. She was once luminous in her moment, seen by thousands, yet unreachable to them, an image projected upon a screen. Now she is distant, her light faint, but still visible to those who look carefully. Her rediscovery is not the recovery of her full brightness, for too much has been lost, but the recognition of her presence in the sky of history, a point of light among many others who have also faded. We might imagine a small archive room, shelves lined with canisters, dust in the air. A reel is lifted, examined, restored. Upon the screen flickers an image: Barbara Castleton, her face serene, her eyes luminous, her gestures measured. The audience of today watches in awe, not because she is a star in their time, but because she is a window into another time. Through her, they glimpse the world of the 1910s and 1920s, the infancy of cinema, the fragile beauty of silent art. To rediscover Barbara is to rediscover that world, to feel again the intimacy of silence, to remember what has been lost. The rediscovered star, however faint, matters. For memory is not only about the great and the enduring, it is also about the overlooked, the fragile, the fleeting. By recalling Barbara, we honor not only her but all those who were forgotten, all those whose names no longer appear in the sky of fame. She becomes a symbol of them, her rediscovery a reminder that no life is truly erased so long as even one voice chooses to speak it again. The shimmer of the star lingers above us, faint but insistent. And as we watch it, another thought arises. Stars, though distant, are part of constellations, patterns formed by human imagination. So too with Barbara. She does not stand alone, but within the constellation of silent cinema, among the faces and names of her generation. To see her again is to see them all, to recognize that the forgotten are not isolated, but part of a larger tapestry, woven together in the dawn of film. In honoring her, we honor them too. The night sky stretches vast, filled with stars both bright and faint. Some dominate the eye, others require patience to discern. Barbara Castleton's star is among the faint ones, yet once seen, it cannot be unseen. It glows with a fragile light, reminding us of the beauty of what was fleeting, of the dignity of what was overlooked. Her rediscovery does not erase her obscurity, but it softens it, offering her a place once more in the sky of memory. The shimmer fades slowly into the night, leaving us with the vast quiet of the heavens. And from that quiet comes the sound of footsteps once again, not upon a studio lot this time, but upon the broader path of history, where countless forgotten lives walk beside her. Barbara does not walk alone. Her rediscovery invites us to notice the others, to turn our gaze not only to the bright, but also to the faint, not only to the remembered, but also to the overlooked. The footsteps move gently, steadily, and as they fade, we are left with another image, the vastness of the night sky above, the silence below, and the fragile persistence of a star that, though once forgotten, still shines. The night sky remains above us, vast and unbroken, and in its darkness, faint lights begin to gather. Barbara's rediscovered star does not shine in solitude. Around her emerge others, faint yet persistent, forming shapes and patterns like a constellation slowly revealed to patient eyes. They are the forgotten pioneers of cinema, men and women who once stood in the glow of projectors, whose names filled programs, whose faces were luminous in their time, but who, like Barbara, slipped into obscurity when the world turned elsewhere. To see Barbara as a star is to see her among them, part of a constellation not of immortals, but of the overlooked, whose collective silence forms a legacy as profound as the legends we more easily recall. This constellation tells us something different than the myths of the famous. It does not blaze with the singular brilliance of a Pickford or a Chaplin. Instead, it glows with subtle persistence, each point of light representing a life once lived, an art once practiced, a presence once felt. Together they form a pattern of fragility, a reminder that history is not only the story of those remembered, but also the silence of those forgotten. Barbara's place among them is emblematic. She was not the brightest star of her generation, but she was part of its sky, and without her the constellation would be incomplete. Imagine, then, a silent theater not filled with applause but filled with shadows. On its walls flicker images of faces we cannot name, gestures we cannot contextualize, moments preserved only in fragments. These are the forgotten performers, their films lost or destroyed, their stories half erased. Yet in their obscurity they share something powerful. They remind us of the impermanence of fame, the fragility of art, the necessity of remembering even what seems minor. For if we preserve only the most famous, we lose the richness of the whole. The constellation is diminished when we see only its brightest stars. Barbara Castleton's life illustrates this truth vividly. She was neither the first nor the last, neither the most celebrated nor the most scandalous. But she was there. She contributed. She embodied a form of silent artistry that mattered in its time. In forgetting her, we lose not only her story but part of the larger tapestry. The constellation reminds us that every star, however faint, adds to the pattern, and without it, the picture is incomplete. The forgotten stars also tell us something about silence itself. They lived in an art that thrived on the absence of sound, on the eloquence of gesture and expression. Their silence was once powerful, shared by audiences who leaned forward in reverence. But when sound came, that silence was dismissed as emptiness, and with it their careers vanished. To remember them now is to reclaim silence as valuable, as dignified, as meaningful. The constellation of forgotten stars speaks through silence, inviting us to listen differently, to hear what is no longer audible but still present. There is a kind of humility in this constellation. Unlike the grand legends, it does not demand attention. It does not insist upon being remembered. It waits quietly, patient, allowing us to notice it if we choose. Barbara Castleton belongs to this humility. Her story does not shout, it does not overwhelm. It lingers softly, asking us to pause, to reflect, to acknowledge. In a world that values spectacle, such humility is easily overlooked, but in reflection, it reveals its depth. To see Barbara among this constellation is to recognize that she was not alone in her obscurity. She shared it with countless others, each with their own story, each with their own silence. Together, they form a community of the forgotten, bound not by fame but by its loss. And yet, in being remembered even faintly, they form a legacy. Their obscurity becomes a testament to endurance, for though they were forgotten, they are not erased. The stars remain in the sky, even when our eyes do not seek them. The constellation also reflects us, those who gaze upward at it, for it asks us what we value, what we choose to remember, what we are willing to overlook. To honor Barbara and her peers is to expand our memory beyond the narrow myths of greatness, to see history as a fabric woven of both the bright and the faint. It is to acknowledge that the forgotten too have meaning, that their silence too is part of the story. In this way, the constellation becomes a mirror of compassion, reminding us to see what is hidden, to care for what is overlooked. And so Barbara's rediscovered star glows not alone, but among others, forming a quiet sky of memory. Each point of light is fragile, but together they create a pattern of endurance. The constellation of the forgotten is not celebrated in theaters or museums, but it exists nonetheless, waiting for those who are willing to see it. Barbara's story helps us trace its outline, helps us understand that to remember even one forgotten life is to honor them all. The night remains vast, the constellation faint but steady, and as we gaze upon it, another image arises. The horizon slowly brightening with dawn, the stars fading as the sun approaches. For memory, like the night sky, cannot hold forever. The forgotten may be rediscovered, but even rediscovery is temporary. The light of day will come, and with it the stars will vanish once more. Barbara's presence, like theirs, flickers only briefly before silence claims it again. Yet even in vanishing, it matters, for we have seen it, we have remembered, we have spoken her name. The horizon glows faintly now, the first trace of morning light dissolving the stars. The constellation fades, Barbara's star among them, slipping once more into invisibility. But the memory of it lingers, as after-images linger upon closed eyes, reminding us that we saw, that we remembered. And in that lingering, another sound emerges, soft and low, the hush of waves upon a shore, as if history itself were breathing, as if time itself were preparing to close the circle of her story. The hush of waves comes to us now, rolling steadily upon a shore, their rhythm patient and unbroken. They advance and retreat, each wave leaving behind a faint trace of foam that lingers for a moment before dissolving back into the sea. In this endless rhythm, we find the image of Barbara Castleton's life, a cycle of silence, memory, and forgetting, returning always to the sea of history. Her story began in quiet, in the stillness of an Arkansas childhood. It rose to brightness upon the silent screen, where her serenity touched audiences. It faded with the arrival of sound, retreated into the obscurity of private years, and ended in silence once more. Now, like the waves, her life has returned to the great ocean of time, her trace faint but not absent, her presence dissolved but not destroyed. The waves remind us that nothing is fixed, that all lives, even those once radiant, will be carried back into the vastness. Fame is no barrier against this, nor is obscurity. We all return to the sea, yet just as each wave leaves a mark upon the shore, so too did Barbara leave her mark. It may not endure in monuments or in legends, but it exists nonetheless. In the memories of those who once watched her, in the fragments of reels that may still survive, in the words we now speak to recall her. The sea takes, but it also gives, for memory, however brief, is a gift. And Barbara's story, though forgotten for decades, has been spoken again. To close the circle of her life is to recognize its unity. She was born with cinema in 1894, the year when moving pictures began their public life. She rose as the art rose, matured as it matured, faded as it changed, and was forgotten as silence itself was abandoned. Her life mirrors the life of silent film. She was both participant and symbol, both individual and emblem. To remember her now is not only to recall a single actress, but to recall the entire world of silent cinema, the fragile beauty of an art that spoke without words. Barbara's serenity, her quiet dignity, embodies that world. She was of it, and when it ended, so too did she. Yet within that ending lies meaning. For Barbara's story is not tragic, nor is it triumphant. It is human. She lived, she loved, she worked, she endured disappointment, she embraced silence. Her life reminds us that meaning does not depend upon fame or upon endurance. It depends upon existence itself, upon the fact that she was here, that she contributed, that she mattered to those who knew her and to those who saw her. We may not know her voice, but we know her presence. We may not see her films, but we know she made them. That is enough to affirm her place within the human story. As the waves continue to roll, we may ask what it means to tell her story now, more than 70 years after her death. It means that forgetting is never final. It means that memory can be revived, that silence can be broken, that names once lost can be spoken again. To speak Barbara Castleton's name now is to honor her, to grant her a moment of recognition, to resist the oblivion that claimed her. It is to close the circle not with finality but with renewal. For though the sea has taken her, we have drawn her forth again for a moment, allowing her to shine once more in our thoughts. The sea itself holds this truth. Its waves erase footprints, yet they also carry whispers, shells, fragments that wash ashore unexpectedly. Barbara's life is such a fragment carried back to us now. We pick it up, examine it, hold it to the light, and in it we see her, serene, overlooked, enduring. We place it carefully back upon the shore, knowing it will return to the sea, but also knowing that we have touched it, that it has touched us. This is the gift of memory, fleeting, fragile, but real. As the waves move, the horizon begins to glow with the first light of dawn. The night is ending, the stars fade, the constellation dissolves, the sky grows pale. The story of Barbara Castleton, too, must end, for all stories do. But in ending, it offers us something lasting, a reflection on silence, on obscurity, on the fragility of memory. Her life was not a legend, but it was meaningful. Her presence was not eternal, but it was real. To have been remembered, even briefly, is to have mattered. And now, in this telling, she's been remembered again. The circle closes with quiet dignity. From obscurity to memory, from silence to silence, Barbara's life has completed its arc. We leave her now not in sorrow, but in reverence, as one might leave the shore after listening to the sea. The waves continue, the rhythm endures, and within that rhythm her story is held. She belongs now to the ocean of time, her presence part of its vastness, her silence part of its music. The dawn brightens, the waves roll, the air is filled with stillness. We close our eyes and carry with us the image of Barbara Castleton, a serene figure from the silent screen, a forgotten star, a rediscovered presence, a reminder of the fragility of all memory. Her story has ended, but her silence remains, inviting us to reflect, to pause, to remember. The hush of waves fades slowly into the distance, leaving only quiet, and in that quiet we hear not absence but completion, the circle drawn, the story told, the life honored.